Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Federica and everyone who was involved in inviting me here. It's a real pleasure and privilege. Let's go back a bit. Here we go. So I'll be talking about really the etiology and treatment of psychopathy. That's what the organisers wanted me to talk about. But to begin with, I'll briefly talk about how we assess psychopathy very quickly, because I know this is a very broad interdisciplinary audience, and my talk is going to be very broad and general. I'll then move on to talking about etiology. And then what I've sort of added in a little bit is looking at the future, looking to see where things may or may not go, as the case may be, in terms of prediction, prevention, and also punishment. But I'll start first with how we assess psychopathy. So many people regard as the gold standard instrument for the assessment of psychopathy the Hare psychopathy checklist. So this is based on a structured interview that an interviewer would do to a prisoner in prison, backed up with reference to case record data. So it's a mix of clinical and actuarial. There are four main facets or features, so to speak, of psychopathy. Psychopaths are arrogant and deceitful, the glib, the charming, but they also lie and con a lot. We think that this is a core feature of the psychopath, a deficiency in emotion, especially lack of remorse, lack of guilt, lack of shame, lack of responsibility. They are also impulsive and unstable. They seek stimulation. They lack long-term goals, they're impulsive, responsible. Importantly, there's an antisocial facet, which is basically criminal behaviour. Poor behavioural controls as kids, early behaviour problems, juvenile delinquency, and so on. So amongst other things, we're talking about criminal offenders, but a group of criminal offenders who have these other features too. So that's an interview assessment of psychopathy in prison, but more and more there are assessments of psychopathic-like tendencies in children. And that's assessed through one of the best used instruments is the antisocial process screening device developed by Paul Frick, a leading expert on child and adolescent psychopathic-like personality. It's based on parent reports. That's an example from the questionnaire. The parent reporting on the child, my child does not show feelings or emotions. And when we talk about this, we use the term callous and unemotional traits to try and describe a child or adolescent with psychopathic-like features. Another example, my child gets bored easily, they engage in risky or dangerous behaviours. So that's one assessment instrument. Another approach to psychopathy is by getting adults to report on their own personality. So these are self-report questionnaires of psychopathy. One well-known one is the Psychopathic Personality Inventory. Scott Lilienfeld developed this. So example items, to give you a feel for this, is when I want to, I can usually put fears and worries out of my mind. I would find the job of a movie stunt person exciting, as long as there's a bucket of water around, to put out the flames. I have to admit I'm a bit of a materialist. So for a psychopath, money doesn't talk, money swears. It yells out loudly. Okay, so that's as much as I'll say about assessment here, because I've a good bit to get through. Etiology, what's the cause of psychopathy? One could spend hours upon hours talking about what are the causes of psychopathy. I'll focus largely on some brain imaging work. There's a lot more to psychopathy than brain mechanisms, but I'll talk just about brain mechanisms. One I'll talk about is a neurological disorder called cavum septum pellucidum. So early on in life, in fact, before you were born, if you can focus your attention on what's inside that red box, this is the septum pellucidum, those two white leaflets of grey and white matter. They separate the lateral ventricles in the brain. That's that fluid-filled space coloured dark. Right in the centre is a cavum or gap or space between those two leaflets. During fetal development, as the limbic and emotional regions of the brain develop, they exert pressure on those two leaflets, so that ultimately those two leaflets with the gap in them will close and fuse, so that 6 months after birth, your brain will look like this. You see now there's just one white line separating the two lateral ventricles. Some people have cavum septum pellucidum, which is reflecting a lack of development of those limbic or emotion regions of the brain. We had people with cavum septum pellucidum. We compared them to those without cavum septum pellucidum. The red bars are those with this neurological aberration, which again is occurring very, very early on in life, before 6 months of age. The yellow bars are those individuals who are normal, so to speak, and what we find is that the cavum group have higher scores on antisocial personality disorder. PCL is the psychopathy checklist, higher psychopathy scores, more arrests, more convictions. So, this early maldevelopment of the emotion regions of the brain is linked to later adult psychopathy, not just in adults, also in children too. This is work by Stuart White and James Blair's group, now looking at cavum septum pellucidum in adolescence, and again documenting that those kids with cavum septum pellucidum, that early neurobiological impairment to the emotional regions of the brain, the limbic system, they have higher psychopathy scores, more proactive or instrumental aggression, and they're more likely to have disruptive behavior disorder. Okay, so one early brain mechanism which at least predisposes some people to develop a more psychopathic way of life. Well, how early are the seeds of psychopathy sown? We would say quite early on. This is Andrea Glenn here, now at the University of Alabama. And she did a study looking at temperament at age 3 and later psychopathy measured by self-report. And what she was showing is that at age 3, those individuals high in psychopathy in adulthood have higher scores on a lack of fear at age 3, measured behaviorally in the laboratory. And also they have higher stimulation-seeking scores than individuals low on psychopathy. So even age 3 temperament differences go on to characterize, at some level, individuals who become psychopathic or are more likely to be psychopathic. You may not be familiar with Cohen's D. This is an effect size. To translate that, the strength of this relationship is between small and medium. It's not a large effect. There's more to psychopathy than temperamental features in the first 3 years of life. But nevertheless, stimulation seeking and fearlessness are temperamental risk factors for the development of psychopathy. And we think that abnormalities to the amygdala, this part of the brain here, underlie the lack of fear, and that abnormalities to the striatum underlie stimulation-seeking and reward-seeking behavior. Let's just turn to the amygdala. It's the emotion region of the brain. In this study, Yarling Yang documented that psychopaths compared to non-psychopaths have an 18% volume reduction in the size, the physical size of the amygdala. Again, the amygdala is, crudely speaking, the emotion region of the brain. So yes, if psychopaths have an emotional impairment, what's causing it? Maybe that part of the brain that gives rise to normal feelings and emotions. Moral decision-making and psychopathy here. Andrea Glenn's work again. If you give people moral dilemmas during a brain imaging task, the trolley dilemma, which I think many of you are familiar with, then what she finds is that individuals, every red dot is an individual, this is their psychopathy score from low to high, and this is amygdala activation on the y-axis. High amygdala activation, low amygdala activation. There is a correlation that individuals higher in psychopathy show a reduction in this emotion region of the brain, the amygdala, when they are making moral decisions. So maybe one of the reasons why psychopaths are immoral individuals is that the function of the amygdala that should give rise to feelings of outrage at pushing the big man off the bridge are functionally impaired. We see here both a structural and a functional abnormality in the emotional amygdala in psychopaths, which may be underlying part of their psychopathic manifestation. That other area of the brain I talked about is called the striatum. It's intrinsically linked to rewards. It lies deep in the brain, blowing up this part here. This is the structure, the cortex, putamen, globus pallidus, the nucleus accumbens. This is the lenticular nuclei. But basically the message here is that this part of the brain is involved in processing rewards. So, talk about structure of the brain and function of the brain. One structural imaging study of the brain, which compared psychopaths to non-psychopathic individuals, found a 10% increase in the size of the striatum, that reward center in the brain. And actually, just a couple of months after Andrea Glenn published that, Josh Buchholz at Harvard, he published a functional imaging study of individuals with a psychopathic personality showing that in anticipation of a reward, their striatum, highlighted here, is much more strongly activated in those individuals with a psychopathic personality compared to normal control individuals. So in trying to summarize very crudely the brain basis in part to psychopathy, I'd sort of try and summarize it in this way for this audience. It's really a bit of a question of balance here. That on the one hand, some kids, some adolescents are not well socialized because they are low on sensitivity to punishments. Think of it as they don't have their foot on the brake in life. They don't have that self-control. And we think that is in part predicated by those impairments I've showed you to the amygdala. That's on the one hand, decreased function and structure of the amygdala. On the other side of the scales, there's a high sensitivity to reward. They are attracted to rewards. Maybe they've got their foot more on the accelerator, seeking out stimulation. And we think that the neural basis to that, in part, is abnormalities to the striatum, which is enlarged in psychopaths and also is more sensitive, seemingly, to rewards. Okay, so now what I'd like to do, in about 7 minutes left or so, I'd like to turn a little bit to the future. I'd like to look, first of all, to prediction. Now, what do we make of, research on the etiology of psychopathy to the question of predicting not just psychopathy, but also future crime? Well, this is a study that Dustin Pardini conducted at University of Pittsburgh. Remember, a reduction in the amygdala, we think, is a risk factor to psychopathy. So Dustin took men in the community, brain scanned them, and created a group who had a smaller volume of the amygdala, compared them to men with a higher volume of the amygdala. And after the brain scan, Pardini followed them up for about 3 years and looked to see which ones committed violent criminal acts. So the blue bar here are those men with a low amygdala volume. We think they are psychopathy prone. That reddish group are those with high amygdala volume. On the y-axis, you have the rates of violent offending after the brain scan, 3 years after the brain scan. And these are the rates, 57% in the group with low amygdala volumes, 18% in those with high amygdala volumes. So a threefold increase in the rates of violent offending in men with a smaller volume to the amygdala 3 years down the road. So the question would be, can we in the future supplement risk assessment instruments with neurobiological assessments, aka brain imaging, for example, in order to enhance our ability to predict who amongst us is more likely to be psychopathic and to commit violent crime in the future? That's a brain imaging study I was mentioning to Stephen. I think I've got a slide that he will like. It's work by Caspi and Moffat here, leading social scientists and neuroscientists. They looked at this question of how can we predict to future criminal offending. So they collected data. This is a longitudinal study, collected data in the first decade of life, in the first 10 years of life, looking at 4 predictors: low SES, child maltreatment, low IQ, low self-control. They found that these measures predicted to outcomes in the future. And they predicted to a lot of things. So they identified 22% of the cohort who go on to account for 36% of insurance claims. That's not too high, is it? But this small group accounted for 36% of these insurance claims, 40% of excess weight. So a lot of outcomes here. 54% cigarette smoking. That 22% accounted for 54% of all the cigarette smoking in the entire sample. Hospital nights, welfare benefits, fatherless child rearing, prescription fills. But what did it predict best to? Criminal convictions, 81%. And Stephen, we don't have any brain imaging here, no molecular genetics, just good old behavior, right? Now, you could say, hey, you're not going to assess people for 10 years. I mean, that takes a lot of work. Well, at age 3, they had a brain health indicator. It's just a 45-minute exam, neurological soft science, IQ, receptive linguistic deficits, poor motor skills. Just based on that 45 minutes, combined with research assistants rating restlessness, impulsivity, lack of perseverance, they predict almost as well to future criminal offending than using data from the first decade of life. So it's an intriguing question. Can we do a lot more to predict to psychopathy in the future? And they didn't design this study to really predict crime. It's almost by happenstance that they can predict. What if we did a new study, taking data like that, bringing in molecular genetics, brain imaging, other neurobiological functioning? Can we do an even better job? So what's in my mind for the future is, how far away is Minority Report, that movie that Tom Cruise starred in? Okay, prevention. So this is a difficult question. How do we change the brain to change behavior? Maybe omega-3. Maybe omega-3. So this is a study in which we gave omega-3 in a fruit juice drink form for 6 months to kids in a country called Mauritius, which is where I've been doing research. Outcome here, looking at callous and emotional traits, which is a sort of shorthand for psychopathic-like behavior in kids. This is at baseline. We've got 2 groups. The green line, or the omega-3 group, controls the red line, who get a fruit juice drink, but it does not contain 1 gram of omega-3 every day. So 2 things happen. First, there's a placebo effect. Both groups are improving. This is the end of treatment at 6 months. After treatment ends, however, the controls go back to where they came on callous and emotional traits, whereas the omega-3 group continued to decline. And that's an average, a medium-size effect. And it's not just the kids. Even the parents of the kids who were given omega-3 show improvements in their self-reports of their psychopathic-like behavior. So, looking at different treatments, what about omega-3, which is critical for brain structure and function? Could it enhance the brain in a way to reduce psychopathic behavior? Of course, it needs replication and extension. This is a different study. Transcranial direct stimulation by Olivia Choi here. So it's a randomized controlled trial. Half the group get transcranial direct current stimulation, which is basically putting electrodes on the forehead to pass an electrical current through the prefrontal cortex to upregulate the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that some of us think may be associated with antisocial and aggressive behavior. Okay, so then the next day they're brought back into the lab and given a social vignette. So these are all men, and here's the social vignette. You're out with your girlfriend at a pub, you go to the toilet, you come back and some other guy's hitting on your girlfriend. And you're really outraged, yeah. And you tell him, and what's even worse, she seems to be enjoying it too. Okay, so one thing comes to another, and the question comes, would you pick up a bottle and whack him on the head? Because, the social dynamic sort of makes it a bit more tense. So there's a physical assault scenario, and there's a reduction. Those who get the prefrontal upregulation show a reduction in their intention to perpetrate that offense. That was significant for physical assault. It was significant for sexual assault. But would we go that far to change the brain, literally, to change assaultive behavior? Punishment, I think I'll leave that to the rest of people because I'm always out of time. And yeah, I'm going a bit beyond my remit, but I find it so interesting to talk about where will things go. as we get more knowledge on the neurobiology of crime, the question for me is, will it change perspectives on punishment? I think the lawyers are best placed to answer that question. But it's partly a question of free will, isn't it? Remember, carvum septum plucidum. It's occurring before 6 months of life. Do we all have the same amount of free will, or is free will a dimension, and some people have more free will than others? What do we do about those with constraints on freedom of will? And then the last slide I want to give you as sort of thought is, yes, we know psychopaths cognitively know right from wrong. And that's what the law's predicated on. What I'm curious about, think of emotional impairments, the amygdala impairments I've talked about. Do psychopaths have the feeling, the emotional feeling of what is right and wrong? And more we are documenting that emotion does inform decision-making. So if there are emotional impairments, would the law in the future, to some extent, a little bit, a teeny bit, take that more and more into account when assigning or making attributions of punishment and responsibility? That's it. I think you're going to introduce the next speaker now, aren't you?